All right, so we're diving into Morgan Housel's Same as Ever today. It's about all those like timeless truths about human behavior and how those end up impacting, well, all of our lives, really.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, almost like we get this backstage pass to peek into like some of history's most interesting people,
Mm.
investors, athletes, leaders, all that. And then we kind of get to see like what makes them tick.
Right, it's those patterns that keep repeating.
Exactly. And it's not even like we're trying to predict the future. It's more like, you know, focusing on those things about people that just, well, stay the same. Like no matter what year it is, it's like, oh, there it is again.
Yeah, like how we kind of just keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
We're emotional, right? We get
Ah.
swayed easily,
Huh.
like by incentives or whatever. It's like, I mean, look at how many times history has, well, repeated itself.
Yeah, for sure. Housel, he actually kicks things off with a story about a skiing trip, and it almost turned out really bad.
Oh, no.
He was with his friends, Brendan and Brian, when this avalanche hit. Whoa.
Yeah, they were really good skiers, planned everything out, they knew the area. But like, even with all that, all the prep and all, they just couldn't, account for the unexpected.
So this isn't about like them making bad choices, right?
No, not at all.
It's more about how we're kind of wired to see only certain risks, like the ones we expect.
Yeah, to
And then the ones that really get us are those that we just, don't see coming.
blindside us totally.
Yeah. And that can have, well, some pretty huge consequences,
For
obviously.
sure. Huge. And Housel, he calls it risk is what you don't see.
Okay.
And he even compares it to things like, 9/11 or even like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. I mean, very few people actually predicted those,
Yeah,
but
exactly. Very few. And as Housel points out, it's those types of events, the ones that, completely catch us off guard, those are the ones that tend to have the biggest impact.
okay, so nobody really has a crystal ball, obviously. But then how are we supposed to live in a world where the like biggest dangers are the ones that, well, we can't even imagine?
That's the question, right? I think what Housel is suggesting is like a shift in how we're thinking about it. Instead of trying to like predict every possible thing that could happen,
Yeah.
I mean, it's impossible.
Right. Yeah.
It's more about understanding like the human element. How do people react when, fear and uncertainty and all that greed, how does all that come into play? Because those patterns, well, they kind of repeat themselves throughout history.
Yeah, it's like the players, but you can't really predict the game exactly.
Right.
But you can kind of see their like strengths and weaknesses, what they
Yeah.
tend to do, what they tend to go for. And that's got to give you some advantage, right?
Yeah, totally. It's about, I think, widening our imagination, even when it comes to risk.
Hmm.
Even small things can set off these huge chain reactions. And Housel actually uses the story of Harry Houdini to show this.
Oh, the escape artist.
Yeah, the one and only.
Okay.
And, Houdini could get out of, well, pretty much any dangerous situation.
Right.
But then he ends up dying from just a punch to the stomach, totally unexpected. And he
Yeah.
was so prepared for like these huge dramatic risks, but then this small, totally unforeseen thing, that's what ends up being fatal.
Wow. That really hits home like what you don't see coming. That's what can really get you.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about expectations. That seems to be, a big theme and same as ever, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Housel, he argues that expectations, especially those that, we get from comparing ourselves to, well, to others, like that can really mess with our happiness.
Oh, yeah. You mean like constantly on social media and seeing everyone's, perfect curated lives. I can
Mm,
see how that would, set you up for some serious disappointment.
totally, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah.
Housel actually uses this example of, how a lot of people, they kind of feel this nostalgia for like the 1950s.
Hmm.
They see it as this golden age, all this happiness and prosperity.
Right, right.
But the data actually shows that, like, objectively, things were a lot tougher back then. Smaller homes, fewer conveniences, less economic opportunity.
Yeah, but those are all like material things, though. Maybe folks just felt more content back then, despite having less. You think that's possible?
It's possible, yeah. But I think Housel, what he's pointing to is like a shift in expectations.
Okay.
He uses this example of a taxi driver who was interviewed in the 1950s. And the driver talked about how, like, his worries had changed. It used to be about basic stuff like putting food on the table. But then as his income went up, he started worrying about, different things like finding parking.
Right.
So it's like this classic example of how, like, as our wealth increases, our expectations, they often rise even faster.
So we just end up on this like Treadmill, huh? We're always striving for more, never really like fully satisfied. It's like chasing a moving target.
Yeah, that's it exactly. It never really stopped. And that's actually where Charlie Munger's advice comes in. He's got this rule. He says, the first rule of a happy life is to have low expectations.
Hmm.
It sounds kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, it does.
But like managing those expectations, that's key to finding contentment.
So basically, like, don't set the bar so high you can't reach it. I like that. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about people who achieve, extraordinary things. The ones Housel calls wild minds.
Yeah, these are the people who like think differently, see the world in these unique ways.
Yeah.
But it's not always, easy for them.
Mhm.
Their unique mental frameworks, they lead to both like brilliant successes, but also some significant challenges too.
So like a double-edged sword kind of thing. What are some like examples of that?
Well, you could take Eliud Kipchoge. He's the world's best marathoner.
Yeah.
And after he won this Olympic gold medal, he just sat there for hours, totally content, just like at peace. And meanwhile, all his competitors were, on their phones, caught up in all the craziness.
Wow, that's some like serious Zen master focus right there.
Yeah, it is. And then on the other hand, you've got John Boyd. He was a brilliant fighter pilot. He actually revolutionized like aerial combat. Genius, no doubt. But he was also known for being, well, a bit erratic.
Yeah.
Really hard to work with, prone to outbursts.
So it's like brilliance can come with some baggage, huh? It's not always a smooth ride.
Yeah, that's it. It's not always smooth. You can't really separate the good from the bad with these wild minds.
Right.
That comes a package deal.
Okay.
Another good example, like Elon Musk.
Yeah.
He makes these bold predictions. Seems impulsive sometimes, but then he has this incredible drive.
But that's kind of what makes him successful, right? He's not afraid to like push those boundaries, take risks.
Exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
It's that unique way of seeing risk, seeing opportunity. It's both his superpower, you could say, but also his, well, potential downfall, too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see a theme here. It's all about understanding, the whole picture, not just the shiny parts.
For sure. For sure. And that actually leads us to another big idea from, same as ever, the power of stories.
You mean like how we're more likely to remember like a good story rather than just like a bunch of statistics?
Yeah, exactly. Like we're persuaded more by, a compelling narrative than hard data, facts and figures.
Right.
Housel argues this, says we're wired that way. And think about like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
Right.
It resonated with so many people.
Yeah.
And part of that was because, well, it wasn't just him reciting facts. He went off script, was inspired by Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer. And then he delivered this message that, well, it really touched people's hearts.
Yeah, it's like the facts, yeah, they might be important, but it's the story that makes them like, really stick. It's how we make sense of the world.
It is how we process it all. And sometimes the story is what makes, certain information, well, easier to like digest. Take Stephen Hawking, for instance. He wrote about incredibly complex physics.
Right.
But he kept all the complex equations out of his books.
And purpose.
On purpose. He
Yep.
wanted to reach more people, so he focused on the story, made it, accessible.
And it worked, right? I mean, his books were huge bestsellers.
Exactly.
So it's not just about like the information, in and of itself. It's about how you package it, how you present it.
It's the presentation, yeah, for sure. Housel, he uses another great example. Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens.
Oh, yeah. I love that book.
Yeah. And Harari, he actually admits that there's not a lot of original research in there, but it's still a bestseller. And it's because, well, he's such a good storyteller. He weaves together all this, existing information, but he does it in a way that's just so captivating, makes you think.
I love how he brings in all these different examples, like Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, Burns is all about the details, especially with the music. Like he actually adjusts sentences in the narration to perfectly match, like the background music.
Wow.
It's that attention to storytelling that makes his documentaries so engaging.
So it's about understanding the power of narrative, especially in areas like, investing, where decisions are often driven by, well, stories about what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, right? Like, are we making decisions based on facts, or are we just, being swayed by a good story?
That's a really good question. Food for thought.
Huh.
Okay, so this next concept, this one really grabbed my attention, does not compute. It's Housel's way of saying that, like, a lot of human behavior, it doesn't make sense, like, if you try to look at it logically.
Yeah, he uses the Vietnam War as an example.
Okay.
The American generals, they were so focused on, things like kill ratios and all that, but they completely missed how those casualties were impacting public opinion back home.
Yeah, they were focused on, like, winning the battles, but they lost sight of the bigger picture, like the human cost of the
Yeah,
war.
exactly. The human cost. And then there's the Battle of the Bulge, where Hitler, he launched what seemed like, well, a totally irrational counterattack.
Yeah.
And the Allies, they were caught off guard because they just assumed that, well, Hitler was acting rationally, and sometimes people in power, they just make decisions that defy logic.
Yeah, and that can have, well, huge consequences, obviously. It reminds me of A.V. Hill's research. He was studying athletes, and he found that psychological factors like, motivation often played a bigger role than like physical limitations.
Yeah, the mind can push the body so much further than we think.
Right.
But that also means, like, our beliefs, even the irrational ones, those can really influence what we do, our actions.
Yeah, like John Nash,
Yeah.
the brilliant mathematician who struggled with schizophrenia.
Yeah, even a mind as brilliant as his, could be impacted by those irrational thoughts. It just goes to show that logic and reason, they're not always in the driver's seat.
Right, right. Okay, so emotions and beliefs, they can really mess with our plans, our best laid plans. What about like economics? Does it always follow the rules?
Well, Housel argues that these historical events, like economic bubbles or market crashes,
Yeah.
they often don't make sense if you're trying to analyze them through like a purely rational lens. Emotions, yeah, those play a huge role. But so do things like, incentives.
So it's not always about making the most logical choice.
Not always, no.
So what motivates people then?
Well, think about, the Beanie Baby craze
Mm-hmm.
or how much people are willing to spend on certain, sneakers.
Right.
Economic value, it's not always about like practicality
Yeah.
or, usefulness. Desire, that plays a big part, and that's driven by emotion.
Right.
Housel actually tells this story about a pizza delivery guy who became, get this, a subprime mortgage banker during the housing boom.
Ooh, I'm guessing this doesn't end well.
Yeah, not exactly. He knew the system was like unsustainable, but he got swept up in it anyway. That potential for making a lot of money quickly, that was just too tempting. And it's that, allure of fast rewards that often overrides our better judgment.
Okay, that's kind of scary. It makes you wonder what other seemingly rational systems are actually built on, really shaky ground.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it actually leads perfectly into our next topic.
Which is, tell me.
Too much, too soon, too fast. It's all about our tendency to, like, push things beyond their natural limits, even when it comes to good things. And that can have some, pretty serious consequences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. Okay, so we're back, and I'm ready to hear more about this too much, too soon, too fast thing. It sounds like, well, something I'm probably guilty of myself.
Yeah, it's a trap, that's for sure. Easy to fall into, especially nowadays with everything moving so fast. Housel, he uses this story about Robert Wadlow, the tallest man in recorded history, and it really illustrates this idea.
Okay.
His growth, it was excessive, and it led to, well, health problems, and he died pretty young. And it's like this reminder that, bigger isn't always better.
Right.
There's such a thing as like a most convenient size.
Yeah.
And when you go past that, well, you can run into all sorts of problems.
I guess that makes sense. It's like, when you try to force a plant to grow too fast, you end up with this weak stem that can't even, support the weight of the flowers.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's about understanding those natural limits. And Housel brings in this biologist, JBS Haldane, and he explains how, like, scaling affects things. Like, a flea can jump, thousands of times its own height.
Mhm.
But if it were the size of a human, well, the physics wouldn't even allow it.
Right.
Like, there are these physical laws that govern how things, work at different sizes.
So what you're saying is, like, sometimes trying to force growth or trying to speed things up, it can really backfire.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We see it all the time,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to investing. Some investors, they try to, like, compress the time horizons for those compounding returns. They take these huge risks, hoping to get rich quick,
Yeah, but that almost never works out, right? It's like those get rich quick schemes you see online. Like, if it
Hey.
sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just individuals who do this. Companies do it too. Housel uses the example of Starbucks.
Okay.
And their rapid expansion back in the late 90s and early 2000s, like they
Mhm.
were opening stores everywhere.
Mhm.
But eventually it led to, well, like declining sales growth and a saturated market, really.
So they kind of like cannibalize themselves, right,
Yeah.
by trying to grow so quickly.
Yeah, they did. And Housel, he uses this other fascinating example. This was from Nature.
Okay.
He talks about fish and how they're raised in like abnormally cold and warm water. And the ones in the warmer water, they grow much faster, but they also have these significantly shorter lifespans.
Wow, that's a really powerful image. It suggests that like, slowing down sometimes and focusing on like sustainability, that's the key to longevity.
It is, yeah. Housel's point is that patience and scarcity, those are essential for long-term success, really. But those virtues, well, they're often at odds with, our desire to make things, bigger and faster.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about like risk and expectations and the dangers of pushing things too far, too fast. What other insights does Housel offer in Same as Ever?
Well, he's got a whole chapter called When the Magic Happens,
Yeah.
and it focuses on this, well, kind of counterintuitive idea that innovation, it often comes from times of like crisis and hardship, not from, those periods of comfort and stability.
Really, I would have thought that people are more like creative when they're relaxed and, they have the resources to experiment and stuff.
It seems logical, yeah. But Housel, he makes a really strong case for, well, for the opposite. He starts off with this tragic story about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
That was, wasn't that one of the deadliest industrial
Yeah,
disasters?
it was. Nearly 150 garment workers, most of them young women, they died because of unsafe working conditions.
Right.
Horrible event, but it also sparked this movement for like workers' rights and workplace safety.
So out of this terrible, terrible tragedy came like positive change. It forced people to really confront the problem and do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. Crisis often creates this sense of urgency, and it compels us to solve those problems that we might, otherwise just ignore.
Right.
Housel argues that that necessity, it really is the mother of invention.
What other examples does he use?
Well, he talks about how, wartime often, well, it accelerates innovation.
Yeah.
Think about technologies like, GPS or radar, even jet engine,
Right.
all spurred by, the demands of war.
Yeah, because during wartime, there's that like intense pressure to find solutions. And all those, bureaucratic and financial barriers, those tend to, well, to kind of disappear.
Do too. The stakes are high, resources get poured into, R&D, and people are just more willing to like collaborate, share information to, solve those critical problems.
So what can we learn from this? Are you saying we need to be in like a constant state of crisis to innovate?
Not necessarily no,
Uh,
but we can apply that principle, that idea by, recognizing that sometimes a little bit of pressure, a little discomfort, that can be the catalyst for like breakthroughs. It's about finding ways to create that sense of urgency, even when we're not facing an immediate crisis. Housel, he actually highlights the 1930s as an example. There's a
Okay.
decade of, immense economic hardship.
Right, the Great Depression.
Yeah. But it also saw this remarkable progress, when it came to things like infrastructure, transportation, even manufacturing productivity.
I've never really thought about it that way. So even the Great Depression, it had like a silver lining.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
Think about all those massive public works projects, the ones that were, undertaken during that time, like the construction of highways and
Uh,
and the electrification of rural America.
Right, right.
Those projects, they didn't just provide jobs, they also laid the foundation for like, future economic growth.
It's a good reminder that even in the like darkest of times, progress is still possible. But it often takes, some kind of crisis to shake things up and force us to find those new solutions. So what about the people who like thrive in those challenging environments? The folks who are kind of wired for stress and pressure.
Well, Housel, he quotes Andrew Wilkinson, who said, "Most successful people are just a walking anxiety disorder harnessed for productivity."
Mm. That's a good one. I know a few people like that.
Yeah, me too. And then investor Patrick O'Shaughnessy, he observed that many of the most talented people I've met couldn't be described as happy. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Like
Right.
maybe some degree of discomfort, some stress, that's actually like necessary for us to achieve, really great things.
So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to chase like, that elusive perfect happiness and relaxation, maybe a bit of grit and determination. Maybe that's what we need to reach our full potential. Okay, let's shift gears again. What other like contrasting themes does Housel explore in Same as Ever?
Well, he has this chapter called Overnight Tragedies and Long-Term Miracles, and it explores how good and bad news they operate on these different timelines.
So bad things happen quickly, but good things take time. Sounds about right.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Housel, he used the example of Dwight Eisenhower's heart attack. This was back in 1955. It was, a big health scare, but it also led to this significant decline in heart disease, like mortality rates, in the following decades.
Because it brought attention to the issue,
Yeah.
right? And that spurred more research and prevention efforts.
Exactly. But that decline, it happened gradually, so most people didn't even really notice it. We tend to fixate on the drama, the immediate stuff, and we often miss that, like slow and steady progress that's happening in the background.
It's kind of like, watching the stock market. You see all the daily ups and downs, but, over the long term, the trend's been upward.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to this really crucial point that we often underestimate the potential for positive change because it happens incrementally. Things can and do get better, but it often takes time. House also points out that, economic growth, it's significant over the long term, but it's easy to overlook because it happens so gradually.
So patience is key. Whether we're talking about our, finances, our health, or even like societal progress, but that's easier said than done, right? I mean,
Mm.
we're constantly bombarded with like news and information that focuses on the immediate, the dramatic stuff.
That's true, yeah, but it's even more reason to try to cultivate that long-term perspective, to resist the urge to, like, react to every little, short-term fluctuation. Think about how long it takes to build a complex system, whether it's a business or an institution, a nation, and then think about how quickly those same systems can crumble.
Yeah, like the collapse of Lehman Brothers or the fall of the Soviet Union.
Exactly, yeah. Those events, they were shocking, but they remind us that even those things that seem so, stable, so enduring, they can unravel in, a really short amount of time. And it's this sobering thought that we should never take stability for granted. It highlights how important it is to understand how, even small changes can accumulate over time, both for good and bad.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these like seemingly different ideas are all connected. It's about recognizing patterns, understanding how, human behavior and history they tend to repeat themselves, and then using that knowledge to make better decisions.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And that leads us to another um, really key concept, the power of small compounding changes.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me about the tiny things that can lead to, magnificent outcomes.
So Housel, he uses this, well, pretty unexpected example to kind of illustrate this whole idea of tiny things having this like huge impact. And it's the Tsar Bomba.
The Tsar bomb. Wait, that was the biggest nuclear bomb ever, right?
Yeah, the biggest one ever detonated. Yeah.
Okay, but how does that like fit into this whole tiny and magnificent thing?
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, I know. But the thing is, the sheer destructive power of this thing, the Tsar Bomba,
Yeah.
it actually made it less likely to like actually be used.
Okay.
The stakes were just way too high.
So it was almost like too big to be practical, kind of like those those giant animals that went extinct because they just couldn't adapt.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes the biggest threats, well, they're not the most powerful ones. And Alzel, what he argues is that it was actually the development of like, smaller tactical nuclear weapons. Those are the ones that really increased the risk of conflict.
Because they were smaller.
Yeah, because it made it, well, people thought, okay, maybe the consequences aren't as bad.
It's like the easier it is to do something, even if it's destructive, well, the more likely people are to actually do it, right?
Yeah, that's the scary part. We really need to pay attention to those like those seemingly small risks, the ones that, on their own they don't seem like a big deal, but then they can compound and interact in these like really dangerous ways.
It's like that domino effect we were talking about earlier.
Right, exactly.
One tiny little push can set off this whole like, chain reaction. What about are there any other examples from the book that show this idea?
He talks about the Great Depression and how, it wasn't just caused by this one like massive event, but by a bunch of smaller economic problems that just, well, they just built up over time.
Okay.
And each problem, on its own, maybe it wouldn't have been so bad, but together they created this, well, this perfect storm.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you realize that paying attention to those details, even the ones that seem small, that can be so important. What about like the COVID pandemic? Was that another example of this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It came from, well, it kind of emerged from this convergence of, well, these smaller risks, like a new virus, global travel,
Hmm.
delays in information sharing, slow government responses. Each of those things on their own, maybe it wouldn't have been enough to cause a pandemic, but together that's how we ended up with a global crisis.
So how do we avoid those perfect storms, Is it even possible to anticipate these kinds of compounding risks?
It's tough, but um, Housel, he suggests we develop this healthy respect for the power of, well, those small changes. And he actually brings up this famous quote by Albert Bartlett. He said, "The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function."
Meaning we just don't get the power of things that, grow gradually but over time. Like it could be a virus or even like dead or even like good habits, right?
Right. And it goes both ways. We
Mhm.
overestimate those big dramatic things, and then we underestimate the impact of those, seemingly small choices that we make every day.
Okay, so how do we shift our mindset to really appreciate, the power of that small stuff?
It's a good question. I think, Housel, what he's encouraging us to do is ask ourselves, what are those small but, sustainable changes, the ones I can make today? They're going to have a real impact over time.
Hmm.
It's about finding that rate of return, and it could be, financial, it could be health, relationships, but it's a rate of return that we can maintain consistently.
So it's not about, hitting a home run every time.
You know,
It's more about getting on base consistently and then letting the power of, compounding, letting
right.
that work its magic.
Exactly.
I love that analogy. It's so much less pressure than trying to, be perfect all the time.
And speaking of perfection, Housel has this chapter called Elation and Despair.
Mm.
And he explores how, well, for us to really make progress, optimism and pessimism, those have to like coexist.
So it's not about being like, blindly optimistic or just, dwelling in all the negative stuff. It's about finding some kind of balance.
Yeah, a balance, exactly.
Mhm.
And Housel, he uses this example of James Stockdale. He was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And he survived years of torture.
Wow.
And his strategy was based on, well, it sounds like these two contradictory beliefs. But first he had this unwavering belief that he would eventually, be freed. But then he also acknowledged the really brutal reality of his situation.
So it's about like believing in a better future, but also accepting, the present, the tough stuff. That's a really powerful but tough
Oh,
mindset.
it is, yeah.
It's not about denying the negative, it's about not letting it, you know, completely define you.
It's about that sweet spot,
Mm.
between hope and realism.
I like that.
And it applies to so many things in life,
Yeah.
Think about like the whole concept of the American dream.
Yeah.
It got really popular during the Depression,
Oh, wow.
like one of the darkest times, right?
Yeah.
Because people they needed something to hope for,
Yeah.
even when things were, really
Yeah.
tough. It shows how, like, optimism, that can be a powerful force,
Yeah.
even when things are bad. But it's also important to balance that, with some prudence, some carefulness.
Yeah, Housel uses Bill Gates as an example,
Yeah.
and despite all his, success, his confidence, Gates always insisted on having enough cash, in reserve to keep Microsoft afloat for like a whole year, even with zero revenue.
Yeah, it's a good lesson in like balancing that optimism, but also being prepared.
Hmm.
Because even the most successful people, the most successful companies, they still got to be ready for, those unexpected challenges.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about risk, expectations, the power of stories, those dangers of pushing too hard, the importance of, those small changes and this need for both, optimism and realism. So, what are some of the key takeaways, the ones that, you really want listeners to remember from Same as Ever?
Hmm. Well, one of the most important things I think is that, the world is a complex place. It's constantly changing. But those like underlying principles of how we behave, those tend to stay the same, pretty consistently.
So, we can learn from the past, not by trying to predict what's going to happen, but by understanding how we've acted, throughout history. Those patterns that just keep popping up.
Exactly. Yeah. In that knowledge, it can help us all make better decisions, in our own lives. And also, he actually challenges us to ask ourselves some tough questions,
Yeah.
like, who might have the right answers, but I'm ignoring them because they just don't communicate that well. Or, which of my current views would I disagree with if I'd been born, in a different place or a different time? And what do I really want to be true? So much so that I might be ignoring, you know, the evidence that says otherwise?
Those are some really thought-provoking questions. They force us to, look at our own biases, our own assumptions.
And that's a good thing,
Mm.
because that's the first step to making those better decisions. It's about being open to new perspectives,
Hmm.
questioning what we believe and just constantly learning.
I think this deep dive into Same as Ever has been, well, incredibly insightful. I feel like I have this whole new way of looking at the world, making decisions.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, it doesn't end here. Keep exploring these ideas, keep asking those questions, and keep challenging yourself to think differently.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into, those timeless truths of human behavior. We hope you found it as enlightening and empowering as we did.